why I got to Kutahya is a bit of a story, so I think I will start by explaining why Kutahya passioned me and is still entertaining me abundantly. There's still a lot of work to be done. The last time I was in Afghanistan was in 1975. And I was taking a tour there, having crossed the whole of Afghanistan, been to the minaret of Jam, and eventually I said, I want to stay on after my tourists go back home. And in the British Institute of Afghan Studies, as it was at the time in Kabul, there was a whole heap of blue and white ceramics. And the classicist who was at the head of the institute said, I don't know what to do with this blue and white. So I said, well, perhaps I could look at it. And it turned out to be the result of a very quick excavation in Kandahar, and unfortunately we all know about Kandahar these days. And they collected this, what turned out to be late Safavid blue and white, which I'd never set my eyes on. So I did my work, I did the drawings, I did the resume, and then unfortunately the archaeologist died. So my resume was never published, or not published quickly. It was only published 20 years later. But meanwhile, I had gone back to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I had looked at the huge collection in the old display, not the new display, and I saw the equivalent of what I had analyzed in Kandahar. And the question...
Are they the same wool to...
No. That was exported from Persia to Kandahar. But it was the end of the Safavid story. It was produced around about 1700. So I said to myself, there are 600 pieces here in the V&A, in the Victoria and Albert Museum. I must do something about it. And this is how I started on my catalogue. But that catalogue had a very interesting segment, and I'll talk about it in the talk proper, which told me, what is this writing? And it was Armenian writing on Persian ceramics. Well, you'll see how it goes as we go along. So I have put on the screen the central element to my story, which is the Armenian merchant. Merchant is the key word, and trade here is the key word. Now, I produced this catalogue, 536 pieces, going from 1550 to, as I put, 1738, but because that was the date at which Kandahar was destroyed, so I pushed the dynasty a bit further on. And then, of course, to balance my catalogue is the marvelous work of Garo Kirkman, which you see on the right-hand side. So, between Persian China and the Kutahya work, I forged ahead. Well, the first time, well, you all know, of course, where is Kutahya. I had to discover it. But the first time a potter is mentioned is in 1445 by the name of Murad. He gives a priest's mantle to the church in Kutahya in 1444. This information you will find in John Carswell's famous book. So that by the time we reach the true Osmanli period, we have the famous two British Museum examples, the ewer and the bottle. But in between, because at the time nobody knew when these were made, in between there have been excavations in Kutahya where what we always call Iznik appears. So that led to the thought that Kutahya was producing a lot of material at the same time of Iznik as a sort of, like in football, a sideline person. Now, just to remind you what the texts are, on the ewer, and this is where we have a date, 1510, this vessel is in memory of Abraham, servant of God of Kutahya, in the year 959, 1510. And they even give the 11th of March. And then on the water bottle, you have two inscriptions, one around the neck and one inside the base. The first one reads, Bishop Termartyros sent message to Kutahya. May the Mother of God intercede for you. Send one bottle here. May Termartyros hold it with pleasure in the year 1529. I have a feeling this inscription is rather copying the message on a piece of paper, because send this bottle and the water bottle, etc., etc. And the other inscription inside is Termartyros sent message from Ankara. May this water bottle be a gift from Kutahya to the monastery of the Holy Mother of God. So, what is important about these two pieces is that we've got two dates, 1510 and 1529, which just shows that in Kutahya they were doing just as good a job as what we've always called Iznik. Now, when Çelebi goes through 1670, he writes, Kutahya has 34 quarters. Among them, the quarter of the infidel China makers. Their production is not only for local production, but the dishes of Iznik are more world famous. And this, I think, is rather interesting to appreciate, that Çelebi, he knew much more than we did, and we didn't go to the text early enough to appreciate that Kutahya was on a par with Iznik already in the 16th century. Now we carry on to my story from where we left it. On the right-hand side, we have a Chinese Qing dynasty, early 17th century, or perhaps early 18th century, probably late 17th century. And on the left, an interesting piece, which in sales catalogues only a few years ago were called Kutahya. And we come back to it in a moment. And again, in a sales catalogue, we have this piece here in the sale in London, which is equally called Kutahya. But in my catalogue, we have this piece, same side, with the Armenian inscription. And this is really extremely interesting, because the cone shape gives us a style which has been copied, as you realize, from the Chinese here. And what we do get with the monogram, we get a date, because some colleagues came to my rescue and said this is a signature for Baron or Baron Safraz, who was the head of one of the 20 business families in New Jufa, in Isfahan, and he lives from 1701 until 1727. Now this is extremely interesting, because there we have a style which is done obviously within the Persian context, but is copied and the Persian context. Well, let's go back to the Persian context, because we have to remember that Shah Abbas, having been entertained royally, I could say, in Julfa, which is on the border between present-day Azerbaijan and Persia, he was, of course, anxious to get their know-how. They were rich merchants. They laid carpets on the ground on his path. They were throwing gold money into the street. It was the most fantastic reception he had. And I can imagine that his reaction was, these are real traders in Jufa. I need these people in my own capital. And it is at the beginning of the 17th century that the 20 big families, merchant families of Jufa, moved to Isfahan. At first, the lived in Isfahan proper, and then a whole district south of the river was allowed to them, and a lot of other Jufite came to live in what is now known as New Jufa. And here is the main cathedral in New Jufa, and of course with suitable tiles, bit of a mishmash here, but still suitable styles to illustrate the fact that the community was a very important community, and not only were these 20 big families there, but a lot of the people who managed to escape the crossing of the river in January, when the whole migration took place in 1603, I think, or 4, a lot of the families prospered. And that is important to appreciate, because New Jufa became, for a century and a half almost, the center of a commercial trading community. And this trading community did go from Lisbon to Canton. Now, can you imagine a network centered in the middle of Iran, in Isfahan, a community who looked after the finances of the Shah and who had in hand, amongst other trade, the monopoly of the silk trade. Now, all this makes it extremely interesting. Just one more example here of this cone shape, this time in Kutahya. There you have it. And blue and white, and of course in polychrome. And this is one of the fantastic pieces, which is in Venice, but we'll come back to it later just to show polychrome. Now, this I put up. Now, there we are in Kutahya, but what we are interested in is being in Isfahan here. And from Isfahan here, the trade routes spread to Moscow. The first Armenian delegation to go to Moscow was in 1672 or 3, something like that. And then you have a very important community in India. The first mosque in India goes back to, I think, 1560 or so. And then we have in Malaysia, a bit later on, a church I will show you in Singapore, and of course Canton in the 18th century. So you must think in terms of Armenian trade springing from New Jufa, Kutahya being in the right place for the potters. Because what happens in New Jufa and the whole of Persia, at the beginning of the 18th century, you have a big problem, and it is the invasion of the Afghans. And the whole dynasty of the Safavid totally collapses. We also must remember that by the turn of the 17th into 18th century, we have a great problem, which is that the Shah is no longer really in a position to protect the minorities and the Armenians, and they start immigrating. And I suggest that some potters immigrate to Kutahya, because at the time the laws were much more lenient towards Christians. So that although you already had a community in Kutahya, you have the extra number of potters coming from Iran emigrating at that stage. So, having said that, you have other merchants at the time, and I couldn't resist showing you a Dutch merchant and his Malay servant, and a Dutch ship. The head of the capital for all the trade was, of course, Amsterdam on the one hand, but also Batavia on the other hand. And if you think that in terms of shipment, the VOC had 100 ships afloat in 1700, you can understand how they would carry up to 60 or 80,000 pieces of blue and white porcelain. This is en passant. So here is a sign of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. Here is our merchants, and here is an English merchant, which I thought we should remember, because the English East India Company is an extremely important one, not as important and not as ruthless, should we say, as the Dutch. So, Batavia being here, the center. So you have the center Batavia and the center of Iran and England, whoops, up there, and occasionally the French, and in the 18th century you have the build-up of the Dutch, the Danish, and after independence, the Americans. Now, we come to design, having set the scene. I just have to remind you that the trading from New Julfa, in other words in Isfahan, the trading was possible because of the cohesion of the families and the organization. And they were very advanced in the education. They had special colleges for traders in New Julfa. And it was in Venice in 1512 already that there was an Armenian printing machine or system. The other place, of course, where you had New Julfas was in Amsterdam, and there's a famous painting where you see what looks like Persians in the corner of the painting, which represents the great Dam place in Amsterdam. But these are the Armenians dressed à la Persane, in Persian. Now, there is this extraordinary rapport, I hope you will agree with me, between the trade and the travel of designs. And I would like you to see what India is producing for the Western market, for Europe, in the 17th and early 18th century. Fantastic designs, what are known as palempores, hangings, bed covers, bedspread. You must remember that the threat of these textiles being imported in Europe was such that both in England and in France there were laws forbidding people to buy these textiles. Because what was so special about these textiles? They were cheap, easy to produce, and they could wash. And this is the great secret of the Indian painted cottons, is the fact that they go on forever. Certain colors do fade, the yellow, and we'll see a bit later on, but on the whole, it was a threat to business, a European trade in textiles. So having taken in these two, and just pointing out here the coast of Coromandel and Gujarat, which was the early area of India where all this was produced, we have a marvelous report, I'm trying to find it, by a French Abbé Guillaume Thomas François Raynal, R-A-Y-N-A-L, and I'll spare you the French and translate it into English. These tradesmen, the Armenians, have been in charge of the painted cotton business for a long time, and he's writing in 1770. And these painted cottons have never been bettered, neither by the Portuguese, because the Portuguese, of course, were in the area, who were just pilfering, neither by the Dutch, who were concentrating on spices. It was, for the Armenians, a competition, but the Armenians knew how to go about it. What they did, when they went through India, they went to the villages along the coast here, and they brought the material. They bought the cotton, they brought it to the weavers, they were women, it's in the feminine. The cotton was made under the textile were produced under their eyes, and then the designs were given to these villagers, and a few months later picked up by the Armenians, who took it across land to the western coast, where they put it on board ship, went to Bandar Abbas, which is on the southern coast of Persia, back to Jurjulfa and the bazaar in Isfahan, and the text says, from there, the materials, the textiles, were distributed to all the different provinces of the empire, and in the state of the Grand Seigneur, well, that was Istanbul, as far as Europe. And because these Indian textiles were distributed by the Armenian traders, they were called Perse in French, P-E-R-S-E, from Persia. But they were not from Persia. Persia tried to copy them, the quality was second rate. So, having said that, let me show you my favorite piece of polychrome Kutahya, which is in Baltimore. Now, collectors, and recently even more so, collectors have been accumulating Kutahya. Whenever there's a sale, the Kutahya really reaches very high prices. But nobody has tried to explain these mad patterns, you could say. You have here animals, leaves, peculiar flowers, and this worried me because it's all very well having a collection, but if you don't explain the designs, you just put pieces next to each other and end of story. And this is another beautiful piece in the Pera collection. There is the inside, and have a good look at the inside, because we're going back to these funny designs. And over the years, and I've been dealing with ceramics for the last 40 years, with Aparte with Divry, I always talk to the piece of ceramic. I talk to it and I ask questions to it. I say, for heaven's sake, give me an answer. Well, this has been long coming, but I think I found the answer. Now, these are two pieces from a baldachin, from a bed, made out of, obviously, Indian painted cottons. And, oops, sorry, I'm going a bit too fast. If you look at these shapes, try and look at the details, and there again, you start feeling, well, there's something I've already met. And that's what you've met, or we've met. Do you see the border here? And look at the leaf. It's not a sas leaf. It's the leaf from the painted cotton. So I really had the shock of my life when I realized this could work. You could create a parallel. And going back to the dated dish, which is 1740 something, I put some extracts of another piece next to this, and this one next to this. So what has happened? You have a really dramatic imagination, creation by the Indian designer here, and obviously the painter is not going to reproduce exactly. It's much too subtle. So what you have an outline with all the main ingredients, with the spots here, and the same thing here with the various areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I was very thrilled when I managed to make them coincide. And another part, same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, well, so 4, 5. And here, it becomes really quite fanciful, but I think you can still realize the different branches or petals of this flower. And once more, you see the leaf here, and here. So I was really struck by the imagination, the inventiveness of the potter translating such themes, which obviously the traders were bringing through. And there again, same repetition, so that you can see it again and again. Now, how come, the traders, the Armenian traders would bring back such textiles? Well, you have to realize that in an Armenian church, this is the one in Singapore, early 19th century, an Armenian church has a rod across the altar and a curtain. Now, during Mass, the curtain is drawn. Curtains can be rich curtains or cheap curtains, and the cheapest curtain would be made of painted cotton. And who would produce the painted cotton but the Armenian traders? There you have your painted cotton across the altar, and another type with typical flowers from the repertoire of the painted cottons. This one is from Echmiadzin, the Holy See of the Armenian Church, where if you know the lamps which are in various collections, you will recognize the lamps here, and the eggs hanging. So, conclusion, you have the industry producing huge palampours, or these great curtains, for the European markets, yes, but also for the Armenian market. Having said that, having looked at the Armenian market and how it is reflected in the usage of the Armenian church, we have also to look at another area. We forget about the Armenians now, and we look at the European market in response to the Chinese production of porcelain. Now, these two pieces here from the British Museum are Chinese porcelain for the European market, and for those who want their emblems in the middle, well, there you are. You have your family coat reproduced. We are at the beginning of the 18th century, as I said. It is the Baroque going into the Rococo. But do you think that the Kutahya potters are going to understand Rococo? And we try to analyze it. But they do see the porcelain coming through. I don't say necessarily these pieces, but what we see here are the shell effects, and look at it here. You've got the shell effect. So I thought that one was quite an interesting parallel also. So we have the Indian painted cottons, we have European Rococo orders to China, and the porcelain coming back. They must have seen some examples. And that's a completely mad one. It's really when the whole misunderstanding has been reproduced. So you have to know the previous path, as you see it here, to be able to detect what is happening in this particular piece. And a last impact of Europe. On the right-hand side, we have the representation of a part of a Rouen faience dish, early 18th century, with what is typical of the time. You find this in all sorts of decorations and textiles. And look, it is picked up on the Kutahya tile, including the angels which you have on the Kutahya eggs. So the whole relationship of Kutahya with the outer world at the beginning of the 18th century, and I would call it the first half of the 18th century, is quite remarkable, because you must sense that through the network all sorts of ideas are coming in from east and west, and they are going to have implications in the designs of the Kutahya goods. So you've seen the implications of the Indian painted cottons, you see the implication of European Rococo on two patterns, and you've seen at the beginning the transition of the patterning from Iran to Kutahya. So in a way, I feel I have started weeding the problems of the first half of the 18th century. But of course, there is the second half of the 18th century in Kutahya. And the problem there is a major problem, because the demand now from Europe is going to be for porcelain. You see, Kutahya is no longer at the top of the market. It's the porcelain coming out of the new European discoveries in Dresden. And there is this extraordinary Augustus the Strong, who says, I want gold, and what Böttger finds is the way of doing porcelain, 1710. So from 1710 onwards, right through the century, everybody's doing porcelain in Europe. What is Kutahya then? It's not quite as good as porcelain. So the sponsors, I sense, in Kutahya no longer know where to look for. So the second half is going to be, of the 18th century, is going to be a difficult period for Kutahya to survive. And you know that by the 19th century, Kutahya is just reverting to reproducing what was Iznik of the 16th and early 17th century. But there is, to my mind, a lot of work still to be done in the fact that we've got a merchant who's looking at another merchant. And I think this is from a Kutahya extraordinary bottle in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it is in this field that research should be done. Classifications needs to be done with all the figures, and it would be a marvelous play you could make out of the figures, putting the ladies together, looking at their dresses. And so I end with this pointer at further work, and I thank you very much for your attention.